Hello, and welcome to YTA Insights, a journey into the world of classical music. I'm St. Flynn. Coming up in this episode, the classical voice. We'll meet the dramaturg of the Lyric Opera of Chicago, who talks about opera and the operatic voice. We'll also meet the founder and artistic director of the Grammy-winning Houston Chamber Choir, who shares insights into the world of choral music. And a noted soprano and former YTA competition judge explains the subtleties of the genre of art songs. Along the way, we'll hear breathtaking performances by the Houston Chamber Choir, soprano Melissa Givens, and the 2018 YTA Music Competition Voice Category Gold Medalist. There's so much to look forward to, so I hope that you will stick around. Behind me is the facade of the Crichton Theater in downtown Conroe, Texas, the home of the Young Texas Artists annual music competition, which unfortunately had to be cancelled last year and again this year due to COVID-19 restrictions. We want to come back to the Crichton even stronger in 2022 and ask that you consider supporting the YTA's campaign for Young Texas Artists. You'll find details at youngtexasartists.org. Now, the annual music competition has been central to the mission of YTA since 1983. Joining me to talk about the competition is its artistic director, Dr. Emmeline Bingham. Dr. Bingham, thank you very much for joining us. Welcome.
Thank you, St. John. So nice to see you.
When did you become the artistic director of the YTA music competition?
I joined forces with YTA the fall of 2007. So 2008 was the first competition for which I was artistic director.
And what does that role involve?
Well, I think there are a number of things that happen that I'm responsible for. One of which is just to sort of to ensure that the competition is run fairly and it is run in a way that is beneficial to not only our audience, but of course the competitors themselves, and that it's a positive experience and a learning experience for them, and also that we allow them to create the environment so that they can perform their very best. The other thing that I do is to make sure that the artistic standards of the competition are upheld with regards to the judges' selection, to the preliminary selection of the competitors, for the collaborative pianists to make sure that they're that we're well staffed and that they are not worked, as it were, and so just trying to make sure that all of those things are kept under a good artistic sensibility, I think.
For the contestants, what is the age range?
The age range is 18 through 30. Although we do allow our singers an extra couple of years, as you may know, of course, singers it takes them a little bit longer for their voices to develop, and they really sometimes don't reach their real maturity as a singer until around 30. So we give them the benefit of the doubt of having another couple of years to compete. But it's meant to be a collegiate level and into the early professional years.
And do they have to be music students? Do they have to be in a music program?
They do not have to be in a music program. Most of them are in school. And, because of that, we see such a wonderful representation of performers from all over the world, which is so exciting. But beyond those collegiate programs, we also have some competitors who are young professionals who are just sort of getting their feet wet in the profession. They may be, sort of just entering the beginning stages of their careers, and it's really fun to try to help them along as they start off in this business. It's really interesting.
And do they all have to be from or within Texas?
So there is a Texas component to that. And I guess the other part of that I did not answer. So no, they do not have to be a music student. They could be, an engineering student, but just happen to play violin really well. And so they are certainly eligible.
Right.
There's The only credentials are a good a good recording by which we have a sort of a pre-selection process that we go through. But in order to make it uniquely Texan, which is really such a wonderful part of the essence of our competition, that they either have to be living and working in the state of Texas, or they could be a Texas permanent resident that's studying in another school or somewhere else.
And you talk about the number of applications that you have to whittle down. How many applications on average are you receiving each year?
Usually about around 80, give or take a few.
Wow.
And we cannot hear 80 people. We try to hear as many people as we possibly can. But it becomes if we hear too many, then it becomes exhausting for the judges, and then they start second guessing themselves. And so it's a real balance that we try to achieve in getting, just sort of the right numbers of people that we can hear, and enough that the judges can tolerate, and enough that we get a good cross section to choose from.
And how many of those applicants would you actually bring to Conroe for the final rounds?
Generally around in the 50s somewhere. So it's a lot for 2.5 days of preliminaries.
And let's talk about the judges themselves. Where do these mysterious judges come from?
Because we have 4 different categories, we want to make sure that we have a judge that's well-versed for each category. So someone who knows the piano repertoire and someone who knows, the string repertoire, knows exactly, at what point to start the movement, so we get to hear part of the cadenza in the allotted time and those kind of things. So we really need not only, an expert in the instrument itself and the techniques and the things that are taught, but we need someone who knows the repertoire and knows what to listen for, knows where those really tricky passages are in each concerto, right? So that the things that we want to listen for. But that is what I think one of my most favorite jobs is recruiting judges.
And I should say that we will be meeting a couple of the past judges a little bit later in this program. Emmeline, thank you very much for laying out the parameters of the competition and making us realize how tough it really is. And we look forward to seeing you again in Conroe when the music competition can come back and live performance can once again grace the stage of the Crichton Theatre. Thank you very much, Emmeline.
Thank you so much, St. John. It's lovely to see you.
As we're focusing on the classical voice in this YTA Insights episode, let's begin the music with a YTA performance that features the 2018 gold medal winner in the voice category. Here is soprano Sydney Anderson with Juliet's aria, Je veux vivre, I want to live, from Act 1 of Charles Gounod's 1867 opera, Romeo et Juliette, in which she sings of the drunkenness of youth and all its possibilities, which she wants to experience before winter comes, the rose is plucked, and happiness gives way to tears. That was 2018 YTA Voice Gold Medal winner, Sydney Anderson, who has since gone on to sing professionally with groups such as Ars Lyrica Houston and the Bach Society Houston, as well as Houston Grand Opera, San Diego's Opera Neo, and Opera Saratoga. Proof that the YTA music competition can play a major role in developing the music careers of its contestants. But how do you judge the quality of an operatic voice in a competition? Here to answer that question and demystify some of the conventions of opera is former YTA judge and current dramaturg at Lyric Opera of Chicago, Roger Pines. Roger Pines, thank you very much for joining me. Welcome.
It's such a pleasure to speak to you, St. John. Thank you.
I want to start with a very basic question, and it's it's one of those questions that's difficult to answer in 30 seconds or less. But what is opera?
Oh my gosh. I think of it a couple of different ways, but the basic idea is that a plot happens through music. A plot is moved forward simply through the voice. I have a problem when people say, oh, opera is theater. Well, no, opera is opera, and theater is a part of it. But without the music, without the singing voice, the art form doesn't exist. Pure theater is something completely different. Yes, theater is an element of this art form, but it's not everything. So the voice really is the raison d'être of the art form. And it has evolved in so many interesting ways, but it started as a mode of expression through the singing voice, through which character would be revealed. And yes, there are certain operas in which are not completely sung, in which there is spoken dialogue, but the essence of it is the plot is moved forward through song and through sung speech.
And you mentioned when opera began, we're back in 16th century Italy with people like Monteverdi. Were they just singing then, or was there a spoken element to those operas?
They were just singing, but if you go back to the earliest pieces that we have any documentation of, and when you listen to them, when you listen to something like Parise Euridice, I mean, it's essentially 99% recitative. It is essentially sung speech, and they had the creators of opera at the time had in their minds the idea of Greek theater as being sort of an ideal, and they believed that the greatest pieces of Greek theater were essentially declaimed in a very musical style. And so that was what their model was when they created these early pieces. And the whole element of genuine song came several decades later. And there's a huge distance that you travel from the first Monteverdi opera that we have, which is Orfeo in 1607, and then in the 1640s he writes the last opera of his that we know, which is the Coronation of Poppaea. There are many more pieces of Poppaea that you can sort of take out of context, and if they're not genuine arias, they certainly are aria-like. There's this whole element called arioso, which is halfway between aria and recitative, and so much of the Coronation of Poppaea is made up of that. But opera took enormous steps forward from the beginning with Monteverdi in 1607 and went over the next 4 decades.
Let's define a couple of terms here. Recitative.
It's sung speech, essentially. It's basically singing according to the natural accent of the word. And if you have a genuine recitative, you can relate it directly to the way one speaks the language in conversation. That's really, I think, the best explanation that I can give. Now, recitative itself evolved enormously the kind of recitative that you have in Monteverdi, in Handel, then later in Mozart is radically different from what you get with the bel canto composers, with Verdi, with Wagner. You know, it changed radically. But the idea of singing directly connected to the natural accent of the word. You can also say that recitative is really what moves the plot forward in most operas even more than arias themselves would.
So what's an aria then?
It's a passage sung by a solo singer, which generally is reflecting one basic idea. Generally, the recitative will be sung in which a dramatic situation will be introduced. And then in the aria, the person will sing about his or her feelings regarding that situation. And what the bel canto composers in the first half of the 19th century would do is they would create something that we could call scenas, that is full scenes. You would have the recitative that I just described, a cavatina, which is a slow aria where the person is thinking about that situation and their feelings about it. Another recitative in which a decision is made, and then a livelier, more aggressive, and usually more vocally flamboyant aria called a cabaletta, in which the person will respond to what that decision has been. Or if it's not a decision, then it's an event that happens to which the person has a very specific reaction. So that's essentially a double aria.
The other, I guess, great element of the tradition of opera are the voice types.
Yes.
Let's talk about the female voices to begin with.
Yes.
We have soprano, mezzo-soprano, and contralto. What is it that separates a soprano from a mezzo-soprano or from a contralto?
The soprano is the top, the highest female voice. The mezzo-soprano is in the middle, and the contralto is the lowest. However, within those basic categories, there are individual categories. The Germans came up with something that we call the Fach system. And a Fach essentially means compartment. It made it easier, and this started many decades ago. It made it easier for opera companies, for people who were casting, to put somebody into a particular area of the repertoire, aka a Fach, so that you could talk about a light coloratura soprano, a dramatic coloratura soprano, let's see, a lyric soprano, a soubrette. I mean, all of these different divisions within. The soubrette being the lightest of the soprano voices, and the hochdramatisch, the high dramatic soprano, being the heaviest. And there were a bunch of categories in between. There are, I think, more individual categories for a soprano than any of the other major vocal categories. So, but in mezzo-sopranos, you've got a lyric, which is lighter, and then you've got a dramatic mezzo-soprano. Same thing for contraltos. And then you have what essentially is a character contralto, which is not so much about the vocalism as about the projection of character with perhaps a more limited vocal range. And then as you go through tenors, baritones, basses, you get these same interesting divisions of the basic vocal category. But soprano highest, mezzo-soprano in the middle, contralto the lowest in terms, not just in terms of range, but in terms of that all-important word tessitura, where a voice actually lies, where the center of that voice is, what is the most comfortable area for the person to sing in. Singers very often talk about roles and whether they are suited to those roles in terms of what the tessitura is. It's the tessitura that is so crucial to the choice of role.
One voice type that is not talked about too often, but I think is making a comeback, of course, is the countertenor. What is a countertenor?
Well, you know, it's a little complicated because if you're talking about a true countertenor, then you're talking about a tenor voice that naturally sits, and going back to that word tessitura, whose natural tessitura sits probably at least a fourth higher than your standard tenor voice would. But a lot of countertenors who have that kind of instrument, the voices haven't lasted. The kind of countertenor voice that has lasted is what is really, you have to call a falsettist. But and I have this kind of voice. I sing countertenor. That's what, I was an extremely poor tenor in college and struggled enormously with it. But when I changed to countertenor and started developing my falsetto, then suddenly I found a range that I could actually comfortably sing in and be happy. But I was absolutely a falsettist. You just use all of the breath support that any good singer would, and you just develop the strength of that falsetto so that it essentially becomes your voice. I never felt that it was this crazy unnatural thing, ever. I was simply developing that part of my voice. So countertenors now, you have essentially a lyric countertenor, the kind of countertenor who's going to be very comfortable in Bach, in Monteverdi. And then you have the more heroic countertenors. And what a lot of them are able to sing is the repertoire that was written for the castrato singers. The castrato singers were extremely important to composers like Handel, like Vivaldi. A man who went through the whole castration process before puberty, and as a result retained that higher voice as he matured and was able to develop that to extremely heroic proportions. So a lot of the roles for the castrati were very high for a man to sing.
You have served as a judge for the YTA music competition on a number of occasions. How do you judge an operatic voice in a competition?
Oh, it's a combination of things. The thing that I start out with is what the size, the color, and the powers of projection that the singer has. What is all of that working? Is the voice solidly based? Does it have a solid base of breath support? You listen to see if the voice is indeed of operatic proportions. Will it sound well in a good sized space? Because don't forget, there's no amplification, and everybody should remember that. There's no amplification in opera unless you're doing an outdoor performance. So say the voice is totally anchored, everything is working well, then I start listening for musicality and for ideas. Do they have something individual to communicate?
What would be a good opera that you would recommend for somebody to go and see if they've never seen opera before? The sort of the gateway opera, if you like.
Okay, it depends, I think, a lot on what their musical experience is. Even if they've never been to opera before, are they aware of the symphonic repertoire? Because if they are, then maybe, I mean, if they've heard the tone poems of Richard Strauss, then maybe send them to something like Der Rosenkavalier. But if it's drama that they come from, if it's a theater person who's never been to an opera, you want to send them to something that will grab them theatrically. If the language is important to them, if they don't want to deal with surtitles, if they want to have the language, hit them instantly, then take them to something in English. For example, Peter Grimes of Britain. What a magnificent piece that is! How extraordinarily moving it is. If they can only deal with the lighter side, then a huge favorite of mine is Donizetti's The Elixir of Love. Because, I've always thought with that piece that it really is not a huge distance that you have to travel from something like Brigadoon, Oklahoma. If they're used to the musicals of the 40s, 50s, what that sound is like, those musical comedies, then how difficult is it going to be for them to enjoy something like Elixir or Donizetti's Don Pasquale or Rossini's The Italian Girl in Algiers? There's no distance that they have to travel, I feel.
Let's talk a little bit about contemporary opera, because I think a lot of people think that composers stopped writing opera the first half of the 20th century, but opera is still being written today. Should we fear contemporary opera?
Oh, no. You know what's really helpful? Is I am so grateful that we have YouTube. Because if your local opera company is doing an opera by a composer that you've never heard of, you can generally, if it's a reputable composer, you can generally go onto YouTube and hear what that composer's music is like and decide whether this is really a style, a sound that you're going to connect with. I think that's incredibly helpful.
Roger, thank you very much for helping us navigate through some of the intricacies of opera. It's a fantastic art form, and one that has been around for so long and continues so strongly today. Roger Pines, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Opera isn't the only sphere that gives expression to the classical voice. Let's take a listen to a performance by the Grammy-winning Houston Chamber Choir under the direction of founder and artistic director Robert Simpson. This is Frank T. Kelly's Earth Song. There are few more prize-winning choral directors than the Houston Chamber Choir's artistic director, Robert Simpson, who is also canon for music at Houston's Christ Church Episcopal Cathedral. Who better to talk about all things choral? Robert Simpson, thank you very much for joining us. Welcome.
Thank you, St. John. Good to be here.
The first thing I have to say is congratulations to you and to the Houston Chamber Choir on winning the Grammy in 2020 for Best Choral Performance. What a wonderful, wonderful accolade for you.
Thanks. It was a wonderful surprise. We were up against some really remarkable choirs, and so we did go out just to enjoy the party, and when our names were called, I was almost too dazed to get up out of my chair, but we have been very, very happy with that success. Yes, thank you.
Tell us about the recording that won that Grammy.
It's the complete choral works of Maurice Duruflé, a French organist and composer of the 20th century. He was perhaps best known in his lifetime as an organist, but he wrote throughout his life, although he wrote very slowly, and so he didn't leave us a number of works. In fact, the total corpus of his writings fit very neatly onto one CD. The most noted piece is the Requiem.
When we talk about choral music, what distinguishes the choral experience from opera and art song?
Yes. Well, I think one of the defining characteristics is that choral music is almost always a group sport. As with opera, there are individuals who are singing and a chorus is amplifying or augmenting, but you really go for the solo voices. And of course, in art song, it is entirely the solo voice. But in choral music, like orchestral music, you are really going for that wonderful chemistry and magic of the collaboration of supremely talented individuals who have chosen to come together and combine their talents to make something that is greater than any one of them could create through the collaboration of musicians in the score.
Do members of a choir have the same type of voices as those that sing opera?
Not always, but more often than is commonly thought. Most voices are quite supple, and you can, with good technique, and this is the essential, it really takes an excellent technique to be able to use your voice in a number of different ways, not just in one. And so, for example, the members of the Houston Chamber Choir, many are soloists. And when they go out to do an oratorio or to be a part of a soloist ensemble, they sing in one way, but when they come to the chamber choir, they sing in another way. Both of them are honestly their voices, but there is a great difference in the way they use their voice, because in choral music, blend and balance is really one of the first things that we strive for.
As artistic director of the chamber choir, when you audition new singers, what is it that you're looking for? Obviously, you're looking for people that can sing and can read music, etc. But do you think to yourself, how will this voice fit in to the rest of the choir?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes, of course. But I'm also thinking about how is this person going to fit into the ensemble? Because the chemistry of the personalities is as important as the chemistry of the voices. And I'm also looking for someone who can do a variety of styles, because the chamber choir sings jazz, pop songs from time to time. It's not our main thing, but very often we will go off from classical music to do jazz or pop. But most often, the stumbling block is sight reading. It is my message to anyone I can get to look me in the eye and say, as a young singer, it is not just about how beautifully you can sing, but how quickly you can get the notes off the page. A professional career really is made in a large portion by your ability to learn quickly and thoroughly. And so it's not just about sitting down and for weeks and weeks and weeks learning a particular piece until you can sing it beautifully. It's about being able to pick up a new score and absorb it rather quickly as well. And so it's the both and. So, I sometimes quip that a person who can speak but not read is called illiterate. And a singer who can sing but can't read music might be in that same category. So I really, really think that putting a premium on being a complete musician, including being able to sight read, is an important goal for all of us.
And I should point out that the chamber choir, the Houston Chamber Choir, is a fully professional choir.
Correct.
These are not people who show up for rehearsal every week just because they love singing. There is an added commitment because it is a professional position.
That's correct. And I love working with people who are not professionally trained. In fact, I do every week as my other position as the canon for music at Christ Church Cathedral. But the Houston Chamber Choir is designed for professional musicians, people who have gone to university and conservatory to train as a singer. And so that is a special thrill as well.
What is a chamber choir?
Well, I think it probably denotes a smaller number of singers, probably up to and including 32. Anything beyond 32 would probably just be a choir. But a chamber choir, the Houston Chamber Choir is 24 singers. And many of the American professional choirs are in the 24 member range. One of the best known and most famous chamber choirs is the Swedish Radio Choir, and that has 33 singers. So that's it really describes a smaller group than a full choir.
And you have sopranos, altos, tenors, and basses. You also have a couple of countertenors,
That's true.
If I'm
We're
right.
lucky enough to have two right now. And so we speak in terms of sopranos and altos and tenors and basses rather than women and men. And so it is in fact wonderful to have two countertenors who are men who have a range that is basically equivalent to the alto female voice. And it is, again, standard operating procedure in English choirs, university and cathedral choirs, for the alto line to be sung by countertenors. But in this country, it is still a novelty, and one that I'm so happy when we have the opportunity to hire a countertenor, because there's a richness to the sound that adds to our blend. I'm really, really thrilled with that.
What are some of the big major pieces of the choral repertoire?
Well, it depends what period you're talking about. Choral music was fundamentally a cappella until the Baroque era, 1650 to 1685 to 1750. Prior to that, whether it be Tallis or Bird or Palestrina in England, it was fundamentally a cappella. And for those pieces, for those composers, the pieces tend to be masses. The Tallis Spem in Alium is one that I specifically recommend people look up if they haven't already heard of it, because that is a phenomenal feat of compositional dexterity in which Tallis has 40 voices, 40 independent voices singing simultaneously. So Spem in Alium is certainly one. With the Baroque era, we come to Bach and his St. John and St. Matthew Passion and the B minor Mass and his many, many cantatas. Handel also wrote some wonderful music, choral music, and oratorios, the most famous being Messiah. But when we get into then the classical period with Mozart and Haydn, the orchestra had been developing and became an essential part of most choral pieces. It's not to say that there weren't a cappella pieces written after the Baroque or the Renaissance period, but the orchestra became a pretty common accompanimental instrument. And then of course we have the Mozart Requiem, which was his last large work. We have going into the Romantic period, the Missa Solemnis of Beethoven, the Requiem by Brahms, and into the 20th century with Britain's War Requiem, which is another piece that I highly recommend people listen to. So these are the kinds of pieces that I'd expect people to want to take a look at first.
Most of those pieces that you mention are sacred works. Mm-hmm. They're works that are tied to the church What about non-sacred pieces? Choral works do not have to be sacred, do they?
They do not have to be sacred, although the church was and remains a strong influence and a strong supporter. But yes, there are many, many wonderful works that have nothing to do with sacred literature, and particularly now, I would say, in our day, choral music is really experiencing a renaissance. And we have great composers like the Latvian Eriks Eschenwalds. We have Eric Whitacre, an American composer, Morten Lauridsen, another American composer, who are writing wonderful pieces. One piece that comes immediately to mind by Eric Whitacre is Leonardo Dreams of His Flying Machine, which is a 8 to 10 minute piece that describes the imagination of Leonardo as he thinks of flying. And there's this one magical moment where the choir is actually imitating the takeoff and this rolling down the runway and the taking off and the taking flight. It's a fantastic piece. So Leonardo Dreams of His Flying Machine is certainly a wonderful case of a secular piece that is very, very important to the choral repertoire.
Another aspect that I assume is a deep well for chamber choirs or any choir is the spiritual.
Yes, that is absolutely true. And I'm thrilled that we're coming to a point now where we see this as being a fundamental part of our heritage. Of course, it grew out of the tragedy and the pain and injustice of slavery. But in the course of the 20th century, several key people, William Dawson and Harry Burleigh, were fundamental in taking the spiritual and bringing it from the field into the concert hall. It was Harry Burleigh, actually, who introduced Dvorak to the spiritual, and at the what was then called the New York Conservatory of Music, which Dvorak came over to be head of for a while. It was thanks to Harry T. Burleigh that Dvorak had enough of experience that he added actually these songs like Going Home to his New World Symphony. But yes, it's very important that we include the heritage of the spiritual, and there are some individuals such as Moses Hogan who have made classic arrangements that I think every choir needs to be singing.
I got a question for you, not so much about the music, but when you conduct, and when most, I think, choir directors conduct, you don't use a baton. We're so used to seeing conductors on the podium in front of an orchestra, and they have a baton. Mm-hmm. But the tradition in choral conducting seems to be you don't use a baton. Do you have to sign an agreement before you direct a choir that you won't use a baton?
No, you don't. And there are some wonderful choral conductors who do use a baton. But a baton is an implement. And really what it allows an orchestra primarily to see from a larger distance exactly where the beat is. So it amplifies the motion of the hand. Mm. With choral conducting, normally, and I would say I switch over to a baton immediately when I'm doing a choral orchestral piece. If we were going to be doing the Bernstein Chichester Psalms, I would use a baton. But just with a choir, it's my feeling that the directions that I can give with my fingers as well as my hand are really important factors in interpreting a piece. So that if I give a cutoff and I'm able to close my fingers for an N before the final release, it adds an important communicative level to the gesture. With the baton, I wouldn't be able to do that. So I just feel that the hand as a whole is much more communicative without a baton for choral singing.
Before we came to this interview, we heard the chamber choir performing Earth Song by Frank Kelly.
Mhm.
Talk a little bit about this work.
Well, it is one of the songs that makes both the singer and the listener melt. And it reminds us of just why we came to choral singing in the first place, why we love it so much. It is both a heartbreaking and a hopeful song. The text that through it all, we have singing. It's emblematic of the kind of emotional expression and healing that we can have through choral music. And it's got it's not a long piece, as we now know. But within it contains so much of the of what really drew me to choral music in the first place, which is being able to tell a story, having a way of making the words come alive through music. And Frank has written a classic demonstration of that with this piece.
21st century American composer?
Yes, yes. He teaches at USC in California, University of Southern California.
We're going to hear another performance by the chamber choir. This is of a piece titled Unclouded Day, which takes us to that gospel repertoire, that gospel tradition that we were just talking about.
Yeah, and that is a perfect example of a piece that comes from a non-classical background or context, and yet is written in such a fantastic way that, again, singers just come completely make themselves just totally open to this piece, because it is so bright and very well written. So yeah, this is a really great piece.
And I should say that it's written by Reverend J.K. Allwood.
Yes, that's right. It's exactly right. But it has been arranged in such a successful way that everyone will really take to this piece.
Well, look, Bob, congratulations again on winning that Grammy. It's a huge feather in anybody's cap, but it's also a huge feather in the cap for the Houston performing arts community. So congratulations on that. And thank you for taking the time to talk to us today.
Thank you, St. John. It's been a real pleasure.
Oh,
There are few sounds as moving as an a cappella choir. But there's still one vocal genre we have yet to talk about, and that is the art song, a solo voice and a collaborative pianist. Soprano Melissa Givens is a past YTA competition judge. She's currently assistant professor of voice and head of voice studies at Pomona College in California. But she's well known to Houston audiences, where she studied at the Shepherd School of Music at Rice University before completing her doctorate at the University of Houston. Here she gives us an overview of what art songs are, and then she performs a French song cycle for us. Melissa Givens, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for being here. Welcome.
Thank you, and thanks for the invitation. A pleasure to talk to you as always.
And you're joining us from the West Coast, where you're teaching at Pomona College.
I am the founding member of the Claremont Colleges in Claremont, which is about 30 miles east of LA.
What I'd like to talk to you about is, I guess, very much in your wheelhouse, so to speak.
Yes.
And that is this whole choral genre, if you like, of art song. And I wonder if we can get a sort of Melissa Givens definitive definition of what art song is.
Okay. Well, it's solo song, can be accompanied either by a keyboard or any other instrument, also encompasses chamber music, either for solo voice and instrument or sometimes duo, trio voices and instruments. It kind of started about 1600, so it's about a 400 or 500 year-long corpus of music, a lot of which is still sung today beautifully. Kind of got its start with Caccini, Giulio Caccini, and the Le Nuove Musiche of 1601, which is kind of the beginning of monodic song, where it was a single voice and a single bass drone instrument. And eventually, got to be more instruments. And as the domestication of music and the rise of the middle class, beginning of music publishing, and the onset of pianos, which needed a place to be sold, which then needed a reason for people to buy them, kind of blew up in a lot of places, Germany, England, France. And it's a little differently flavored in all of those places, called different things. We call English songs airs, or as they ended up being shunted into opera, arias, or canzonettes, or canzones. French would be chanson, mélodie. And of course, German Lieder is well known and well beloved.
What is a song cycle then?
Good. So songs were often in those early days published to help make either a publication company like, say, Novello, rich and famous, or to help to promote certain composers. So whereas original songs would have normally been printed in a newspaper circular, just a one-off thing, they began to be published in collections. And so in the beginning, a lot of those collections weren't linked by any kind of thematic structure or harmonic structure. It was just like, I've got these 6 songs, you can put them out. Let's call it Opus 4. And then eventually Beethoven started thinking more cyclically. An die Ferne Geliebte is recognized as the first true song cycle, which is a group of songs, can be as few as 3, can be as many as 40 or more, that are linked in some way by story or by poet. Some of the ones we know very well are the Schubert cycles of Winterreise, which is a winter's journey, or the Schumann Dichterliebe, which is the poet's love. And they've been used by everybody. Wagner has a couple of really famous cycles, and Poulenc, of course, who I think we'll talk about later. So I'd say early Romantic through now is when they're popular. And they're on everything from The Miller's Daughter, which is the Schöne to Craigslist. There's a composer named Gabriel Kahan who has written the Craigslist Lieder, which are literally ads on Craigslist. All kinds of points, the Rückert Lieder of Mahler, which were more themed by the composer, the poet Rückert, and then say Wolf, who did an entire 2 sets on the Spanish songbook and the Italian songbook. So the themes, the things that draw them together as a cycle is vast. And it could be that there are harmonic relations between things that you sort of want to do them in order, and sometimes they're more loosely related that way.
One of the things that marks the art song is that, generally speaking, and correct me if I'm wrong, the composer is setting a pre-existing text. In
Yes.
other words, they're not necessarily writing their own libretto, are they?
Correct. Primarily they're pre-existing poems. Often, especially in the 19th century, there'll be poets who are related to the composer in that social circle. So Eichendorff was a big friend of Mendelssohn's, and Goethe was someone who Schubert admired greatly, and actually was somebody who Mendelssohn knew. So there were sometimes these were relationships that were just extended through this creative process, and sometimes they were just poets people knew of, that they're older. Petrarch, of course, still.
Yeah. Now, you are a soprano, and
Yes.
you have vast experience in the operatic world
Mm-hmm.
and in the choral world, and you also sing a lot of art songs.
I do.
How is that singing different for you to sing a song cycle as opposed to singing a principal role in an opera where you're singing arias and duets?
Absolutely. It's a very good question. And it sort of comes down to scale or scope. A character in an opera is sustaining one character and all of the things that happen to, for, with, and against that character over a 3-hour arc. So you're one person for the whole evening. There's less often characters in choral music. Those are often more corporate types of texts or corporate type of ideas. And in a song cycle, or just regular songs, whichever you're looking at, you're dealing with discrete characters over the course of a 3-minute span. So it's more concentrated dramatic interpretation. I always tell my students, you can't sing this music if you don't know who the singer is, who's telling the story, whose story are they telling? Because storytelling is what differentiates us from other instrumentalists and musicians. So it's about scope. And I think it's more challenging to me to do an evening of art song than, an evening of an opera or even an opera arias. I think there's an intimacy in song cycles. There's almost an immediacy with the audience when you're doing a song recital. And it just gives you more flexibility for programming, of course.
And also there's a greater intimacy with the instrument that's accompanying you.
Absolutely.
Which is the piano, because
often
you're both so exposed. Is it difficult to negotiate that relationship or that interface?
No, and in the best situations, it works as a partnership. We explore the score together. We figure out where the places are. Composers try to think about things like range and tessitura, but sometimes they get a wild hair and write something that's, if you sing it loud, it's still going to sound soft because of where it is in the range. So your collaborative artist has to be, attuned to what the human voice does and what the particular singer wants to do. There are places where my collaborative partners will want to take more time, either because something's funky for the piano or just because it's a moment that requires a little bit more moment, And so we work on those things together. I have been so very fortunate to have stunning and really wonderful collaborative partners over the years. I've always felt in those situations that I could be trusted with my artistic intent, and I could be trusted to do what I wanted to do artistically and know that they would be right there and that we'd be making these decisions together for the benefit of the music.
Am I right in thinking that oftentimes composers, when they're writing a song cycle or just a collection of individual songs, that they don't necessarily specify a voice type that they're writing for?
Correct. Yeah, a lot of times you'll just see medium or high or low. And I think we're getting a little bit more Catholic about who can sing what. I think it's just in the last 10 years or so that women have started to sing Winterreise, which has been considered verboten for God knows how long. Should men sing Frauenliebe und Leben? Of course, there's some discussion whether anyone should sing Frauenliebe und Leben because that idea of womanhood can be so outdated. Lord, those discussions keep going on in all the songs. But I approach it from a storyteller perspective, and I encourage other people to do so as well. This is a story. It might not be your story, and it might not even be story that you can really inhabit because of your own experiences, but there's always something that you can connect to on some level that you do have in your experiential wheelhouse that allows you to tell that story, because those are stories that all need to be told. And we can't always rely on the original owner of the story to tell it.
So what is it that you look for in an art song or a collection?
Sometimes I'll start with the composer. Sometimes I'm specifically looking for a composer's music. I run across a lot of things, you know, as a voice teacher. I'm always getting new scores in and seeing what Glendower Jones has new in classical vocal reprints. So I look for texts that are important and that need to be told. I look for composers whose harmonic and melodic language works for me and my process. So I would say text, melody. If the harmonic language is something that I think suits the music and suits the text, I'll look for that as well. And of course, there's just, you know, there are bucket list pieces like the 4 last songs of Strauss, which I've only gotten to do in a ballet situation. You know, there's always something on the list that I want to do. So,
what about the American tradition of art song? Because when we think of art songs and song cycles, we think of you know, the German romantics.
right.
But what about art song within the American tradition?
It is such a rich repertory, and you know, I encourage more people to explore it. And it probably safely goes back to the 19th century. I'm pretty sure Louis Moreau Gottschalk wrote songs. Certainly, the American song composers were being influenced by the major schools, of course, the German school, and the Russian school, and the French school. But you know, we call Aaron Copland the dean of American music. He has written innumerable pieces for voice that kind of speak to the American experience, because they're often American poets. Emily Dickinson is very strong among them. There is a huge untapped resource and repertory of art songs by composers of color, especially in the Harlem Renaissance. Composers like William Grant Still, Florence Price, Margaret Bonds, even though he wasn't American, Coleridge Taylor, just scads of music people don't even know. Lena McLin, Betty King. One of the projects I'm recently completed and I'm working on another stage of is compiling an annotated list of these songs that are out there that are easily accessible, that people should be learning and not shying away from, because maybe, well, this is about the Black experience. A lot of it's just, I mean, Shakespeare, Paul Laurence Dunbar, Langston Hughes. These are poems that anyone can relate to for any reasons. There's a huge resurgence, I think, of art song composition. There are lots of groups springing up to promote the composition of lieder and art song. NATS, the National Association of Teachers of Singing, has an art song initiative that hopes to kind of raise the profile of art song singing in our curricula, which tend to be very operatically focused, which may or may not be helpful for a lot of places and a lot of people. As music becomes more entrepreneurial in our increasingly unfunded age, you kind of have to have a tool in your toolkit, and art song is a great tool. It's easy, it's portable, it's small forces and great payoff.
We're going to hear you perform a song cycle with Shannon Hesse at the piano. Music by the French 20th century composer, Francis Poulenc. It's titled La Courte Paille, the short straw.
Yes.
Introduce this.
The short straw means kind of what you think it is. It's the person who draws the short straw, and it actually has very little to do with these songs. They were composed in 1960 to texts by the Belgian poet Maurice Carême, and they were written for and dedicated to Denise Duval, who was a singer friend of Poulenc's in the 50s and 60s, who had recently had her own small child. And so they're related. They relate in some way to the idea of childhood and wonder. There's 7 songs. The first one is called Le Sommeil, which is sleep, and the mother can't get her baby to sleep, and she's calling on, the bear constellation and the Sandman to come and please let this baby sleep. And then I think there's 2 that are kind of my favorites. The second one is the flea and the elephant, and it's an elephant who's carrying a flea, and the flea is eating some jam, and then the wind blows them away, and what an adventure. Who would believe this sort of thing could ever happen? And then the Queen of Hearts is just a beautiful, tiny little poem about how this house with frost windows is being entered by these people who are not sure what's happening, but it's the young dead are singing songs of love, and the Queen of Hearts is beckoning you to come. Puss in Boots, also very short. I think the whole cycle is 8 minutes. Puss in Boots is just a bunch of nonsense sayings and how the cat wants to go out and do what it wants to do, and who are you to stop him? Le Girafon is about a little baby giraffe. Actually, Le Carafon, sorry. It's about a carafe who sits on a porch within view of this zoo where this giraffe has just had a baby. And the carafe wants to know why she can't have a baby too. And a past sorcerer's assistant comes by and records her on his machine and sends it to Merlin. He says, okay, here we go. Poof. And so the next morning, the mistress of the house comes out and there's a little baby carafe next to the mama carafe. And then there's the angel musicians who play Mozart in the rain like they always do. And the last one is called Moon of April. So we're almost, timely with it. And it just says, moon, show me these things that are wondrous. A fish that laughs at hail, and a place that is sunny with primroses and where they've broken all the guns. So it's a just expansive, light, very atmospheric ending to the song cycle, and just truly, to me, a really beautiful, touching piece.
And that final song, Lune d'Avril, it's almost a lullaby, isn't it?
Yeah, lullaby for all of us, not necessarily trying to get babies to sleep, but just that deep wish for peace. Yeah.
Well, we are going to hear now Melissa Givens performing Francis Poulenc's La Courte Paille, The Short Straw. Shannon Hesse is at the piano. But before we hear it, Melissa, thank you very much. I really appreciate you talking to us.
Oh, thank you so much. Just a pleasure, and glad, as always, to talk to you whenever I can.
Thank you very much. gorgeous voice of Melissa Givens, singing music by Francis Poulenc. Thank you to Melissa and the Houston Chamber Choir for sharing their music making with us, and also to Roger Pines, Robert Simpson, and Sydney Anderson. We're grateful to all who make the work of Young Texas Artists possible, including the YTA Circle members, all patrons and audience members, and of course, the city of Conroe. Your support helps keep great music alive in Texas and beyond. To find out more about YTA, visit us online on Facebook and on YouTube. I'm St. John Flynn. I hope you've enjoyed this brief journey into the world of the classical voice and that you'll join us again next time.